In this video, we'll set up a quick render. Alright, so now let's go ahead and set up the scene. Now the great thing about working with rendering in Revit is it's taken into account some real-world information. When we first started out our project and we were doing our solar studies, if you recall, we went ahead and set up our project location, which was in San Diego. Well, that's going to be taken into account when we're doing our rendering. Not only that, time of day, time of year, things like that, all get taken into account to make this even more realistic. And when you're doing your rendering in Revit, it's all going to be physically based rendering. So what do I mean by physically based rendering? So as you recall, we created this material of our own here. If I go to the edit type and go to its structure, and we can actually jump to any one of its materials here. And let's say we went to this polyvinyl one we created. If you recall, not only did we have graphics and appearance, which were the consistent color and then the rendering, but we also had physical and thermal properties. So the thermal properties get taken into account when we're running any kind of analysis or any kind of energy modeling. And the physical properties take into account the physical strength of a material. So physically based rendering is going to take into account real-world information associated with your materials and with the nature in which light bounces around off of material, reflects, refracts, all these things. Alright, so just keeping that in mind when we're doing this. It's more than just clicking something and, a pretty picture appears. There's a lot of science that actually goes behind this in this physically based rendering stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of this here. We'll get out of here. Now that we talked about that, let's go ahead and set up a render. So there's a couple of ways you can access your render settings. So if we went to the View tab, I could access it here in the Graphics panel underneath my render. Or if we're in the View control bar, I can come to the teapot here. I can select on it, and it's going to bring up my rendering dialog. And not only that, when I'm in a view, I can access the view's properties, and within those properties, underneath the camera section, I have access to the render settings as well. So let's go on ahead and do it through the View tab. So I'm going to go to my View tab. I'm going to click on Render, and what it does, it brings up my render dialog here that I can actually move around as needed. So while I'm working on my image, I can make my image a little more visible. So a couple of things to pay attention to. One is going to be the quality. We'll work with that. We'll also work with our lighting here, which we should be a little bit familiar with, taking into account the actual physical location and time of year and time of the day. And we're also going to talk a little bit about working with this background, which I really like. I found to be a really handy tool. And last but not least, we'll tackle this after that. But let's go ahead and get things set up. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my lighting, which means I'm going to tackle my scheme and location. So underneath the scheme here, since we are going to be working on the exterior, and since we haven't really put any design energy into designing the landscape, we're mainly focusing on the actual architecture of the building, we're not going to have any artificial lighting really to work with. So we're more concerned with how natural light is going to interact and go on, how it's going to display also in this view here, simply with natural light in the architecture. So we have exterior sun only. Had I been working on an interior scene, I could have went with any one of these options here. Maybe I want to test out the nature of lighting. I can go with artificial, so on and so forth. But for us, exterior sun only. Now let's go ahead and set up this sun here. So I'm going to click on my area here to access my sun settings. So let's go ahead and do this type of solar study we're actually going to be doing. We're going to create a still image. So I'm going to click on still. And then for presets, I'm going to go with my set. But if I wanted to go with a more specific one, maybe want to go with the summer solstice, I can do that. But doing that or going to any one of these automatically populates the date here. And everything is automatically set to 12. Now you can go back in, adjust the dials if you want to, but these are nice presets. They give you a nice spot, time to work with, nice intervals throughout the year. But for us, I'm going to go with still, and I'm going to go ahead and select a day, which we'll go with this one. And I'm going to change my time from 3 o'clock to, let's say, 2 o'clock. I'm going to make sure that I'm on level 1. So now we have everything we need set. I'm going to say apply, OK. And now we're about ready to set up this render. But before we do, let's talk a little bit about render quality. Now, when it comes to rendering, you got to think about time and rendering, right? So the longer it takes to render is usually associated, or is always associated, with the quality. So a better quality render is going to take fraction of the time to render than it would for an image with a high quality. So with that in mind, we have our quality settings here. Now this is great for if you're just gradually working on things and you really don't want to crank up the dials just yet and go all the way full forward, turning up all the dials to get the highest quality you can. If you're working and tweaking the dials just a bit, setting up scenes, you may want to work on a lower setting, like draft, medium, maybe even high. So we'll go ahead and set it to draft right now so we can experience what a draft versus high and all those things are. So we'll set that up. And again, we already have this set. And I'm going to go ahead and set up my background to be style is going to be few clouds. Now what this gives us a really cool option when we're rendering this for an exterior scene of a building to have a background. I can go with no clouds, few clouds, many clouds, but it gives us and actually brings in a sky into our project. And if we don't want to rely on what we already have preset here, I can actually bring in a custom image, which I'll show you how to do later on. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and go with few clouds, and I like where we're at. So we have everything set up. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and click on render and take a look at what happens when we click on render. Our render progress window comes up and it kind of lets us know what's going on. So right now we're at 0%. So as we wait, we're going to see our image the quality of that image start to increase. Now take a look at this. Pretty cool, right? So this is just a draft and you can see how realistic that looks already. So we have our trees that look pretty realistic. The grass is pretty granular but realistic. But take a look at the shadows and even the sky settings that we brought in. So that's just on a draft setting. But let's say we want to crank things up a bit. Let's say we want to improve the quality, but I also want to add my own image to the background. This is great, but I can make additional adjustments. And I'll show you how we can do that in the next clip, and we'll also talk about adjusting our exposure.